A couple of months ago, I took a look at the GTX 1660 and showed how it's a killer 1080p graphics card. If you're interested in checking that video out, I've placed a link to it in the cards up here and in the video description. When reviewing a GPU, most PC tech reviewers will pair their graphics cards with the most powerful CPUs on the market in order to ensure the maximum performance from the graphics card they're reviewing. I, on the other hand, decided to do things a little differently because, in my opinion, the vast majority of gamers out there don't have systems with CPUs like the 9900K or the Ryzen 9 3900X. And the reason they shop in the $250 and below GPU market is simply because that's what they can afford. In my GTX 1660 video, I wanted to show more of a real-world scenario. You know, to just kind of show what kind of performance you can expect out of a graphics card upgrade when you're a gamer playing on a $500 or $600 entry-level rig that fits into your budget, or if you're, playing on an older hand-me-down computer from your parents or someone else. I chose to pair the 1660 with both a Ryzen 7 2700X, which isn't the highest end CPU out there, but is definitely on the higher end, to illustrate the maximum performance the 1660 is capable of, and then paired it with an AMD A10-5800K system I built some years ago. I found that the GTX 1660 is far too powerful a card to pair with a CPU like the A10-5800K. It was being bottlenecked by about 50% most of the time in games that I tested, and sometimes more because the A10 CPU is just too slow to really complement the GTX 1660. Which is what brings me to this video. The RX 570 has the reputation of being the best bang for the buck graphics card at this point in time. It's capable of running most any game out there at 1080p at or above 60 FPS with the graphical settings cranked up pretty darn high. Most modern AAA titles, it can't quite do max settings and still maintain 60 FPS, but you can easily have them high enough to still enjoy most all of the eye candy and still maintain that 60 FPS sweet spot. The question that I plan to answer in this video is, how well does the RX 570 pair with older, slower CPUs like my A10-5800K? And hopefully give you an idea of how the RX 570 may perform in your rig should you choose to upgrade to it. As I kick this off, I should also mention the RX 570 is a pretty decent overclocker. I used MSI Afterburner to squeeze just a little more performance out of it. I bumped the core frequency up to 1380 MHz from the stock 1268 MHz and the memory up to 2000 MHz from 1750. In most of my games, this gave me an increased frame rate between 5 and 10 FPS, but in Doom, I saw an astounding 20 FPS uplift in the Vulkan API. Okay, I've rambled on way too long here. Let's get to the games. Due to its continued popularity, the first game on our list is Fortnite. When pairing it with my Ryzen 7 2700X, I was able to maintain over 60 FPS at all times with all settings on Epic. Except I did have to turn shadows down to high. As you can see here at the beginning of the match, our frame rate is very good as I run around looting and harvesting materials. This particular area of the map must be more GPU intensive or something, because this is where I experienced my lowest frame rate of the entire match. Midway through, my frame rate was in the 90s and even got above 100 FPS at times. One moment that kind of surprised me how high my frame rate got was during this sequence here when I have two other players trying to eliminate me and luckily build my way out of there. By the end of the match, my frame rate was still in the 80s and 90s. Sure, that probably has a lot to do with where I was at on the map too, but needless to say, the RX 570 handled itself very well in Fortnite with my 2700X. When pairing the 570 with my A10-5800K, however, things looked quite a bit differently. At the beginning of the game, my frame rate was still above 60 FPS, which was awesome, but you'll now notice that the GPU utilization percentage is lower than it was before. When paired with the 2700X, that was at 100% pretty much the entire time. With the A10, however, it's usually somewhere between 60 and 80%. With the GPU not being fully utilized, this, of course, affects our frame rate. By mid-game, the frame rate is all over the place, ranging from the 40s to the 60s, with occasional drops into the 20s and 30s. When these really massive drops happen, you can see that our CPU utilization is way up. This simply means the A10 is working as hard as it can, but it just can't keep up with the RX 570. If you've heard of CPU bottlenecking but aren't sure what it is, this is it. When paired with a more powerful CPU, the RX 570 has no problem running at a very high frame rate all of the time. However, when you pair it with a CPU like the A10-5800K, the slow performance of that CPU really limits the 570's performance. Lately, I've really been enjoying playing The Division, and recently picked up The Division 2 also, but haven't started it yet, so even though it's a few years old, I'm using the first Division game for this video. In The Division, I was able to run on the high preset and consistently stay above 60 FPS at 1080p when paired with my Ryzen 7 2700X. When you're outside in this game is when you see the biggest hit in performance. In this particular section that I captured, the frame rate stays above 70 FPS most of the time, but in this game there are areas where there are a lot of buildings and debris and other detailed stuff on screen at the same time, and it'll drop your frame rate down into the 60s with some very brief dips into the mid to high 50s on the high preset. For the most part though, the 570 runs this game way over 60 FPS. When you're inside buildings and stuff, the frame rate jumps up pretty significantly into the 90s and even over 100 FPS a lot of the time. Of the 6 games I tested, The Division is the game the A10 struggled with the most. When I was inside of buildings and stuff, the frame rate seemed quite good, in the 70s and 80s, but when I went outside, the frame rate would drop into the 40s and 50s, and in some areas, even down into the 30s. CPU usage was pegged at 100% pretty much all the time when I played The Division, so just like we saw in Fortnite, the A10 just couldn't feed info to the 570 fast enough. Moving on to Shadow of the Tomb Raider, when paired with my A10 system, I got a bit of a mixed bag of performance. In many areas of the game, GPU usage was between 70 and 80%, which gave us a frame rate in the 40s and 50s, even in some of the larger outdoor areas. However, in an area of the game called the Hidden City, we encountered a pretty huge CPU bottleneck. This area is much larger than any of the other areas in the game I've played so far, and had a lot of NPCs and stuff running around and whatnot. Here, CPU usage was of course pegged at 100%, and the GPU usage dropped down to between 40 and 50%, which then just tanked the frame rate into the 20s. This made things feel pretty choppy. This is by far the worst performance I saw in this game. Like I already mentioned, in most areas the frame rate was in the 40s and 50s and would even move above 60 FPS depending on what all was going on. This much better frame rate is what I experienced when Lara was inside exploring tombs and even in many outdoor areas. With Tomb Raider being more of an adventure/puzzle game, thankfully you don't really need a super high frame rate to enjoy it. Other than the times the frame rate dropped into the 20s, playing Shadow of the Tomb Raider on the A10 was actually quite enjoyable. When switching over to the 2700X on the other hand, we find out what the RX 570 is actually capable of. 60 FPS at high settings is no problem at all. On average, I saw about a 20 FPS uplift in this game when switching to the more powerful 2700X CPU. Another one of our top performers was 2016's Doom. I like using this game in videos like this because, well, it's one of the few games I know of that uses the Vulkan API, and it's also one of those games that looks really good, is loads of fun to play, and runs well even on lower end hardware. Using the Vulkan API at 1080p on ultra settings, the RX 570 crushed this game. When paired with my 2700X, it ran well over 100 FPS, even in rooms filled with enemies trying to turn me into a permanent resident of hell. Even when paired with the A10, it never fell below 60 FPS. In fact, unless there was a crap ton of enemies on screen, it ran anywhere between 80 and 100 FPS. This may be just my opinion, but FarCry 5 is a perfect game to showcase how the RX 570 is the current 1080p 60 FPS value king. When paired with my Ryzen 7 2700X, I was able to run FarCry 5 on ultra settings and maintain an almost constant 60 FPS or higher at 1080p. It did occasionally drop into the 50s, but always came back up over 60 almost immediately. It impressed the heck out of me that a $160-ish graphics card can run this game that well at that kind of detail. Like Tomb Raider, when paired with the A10-5800K, our frame rate decreased by about 20 FPS at the same resolution and settings. While I feel the game is still playable at this frame rate, I'm sure there are others out there that would disagree strongly with that opinion. But this is my video, so mine is really the only opinion that matters right now. The final game I tested for this video is Ghost Recon Wildlands. Once again, when paired with the 2700X, the power of the RX 570 really impressed me. Wildlands is known for being a very demanding title, and the 570 was able to handle the very high preset at 1080p very well. I had a couple times where the frame rate dipped into the 50s, but for the most part, it stayed well above 60 FPS. I only wish the same could be said when paired with the A10-5800K. Performance wasn't quite cut in half when using the A10, but there were times it got pretty close. Like I experienced in FarCry and Tomb Raider, the frame rate was often 20 or more FPS lower in Wildlands. And while I could still play the game okay at 30 and 40 FPS, it's tough to do so knowing the RX 570 is capable of much better than that. Now, I do recognize that many of you out there watching this video trying to decide if the RX 570 is worth spending your money on don't have either of the CPUs I used in this video. The idea that I'm going for is showing the two extremes in hopes that your CPU's performance is somewhere between these two. The A10-5800K is on par performance-wise with 5 and 6-year-old i3s and is also pretty close to an FX 6100. If you have an i3 from within the last 3 or 4 years, or an i5 or i7 from within the last 5 years, I think you'll be able to get much closer to the maximum performance of the RX 570. On the AMD side of things, to get the best performance out of the RX 570, you'll need to have an FX 8300 series chip probably, or a Ryzen 3, Ryzen 5, or Ryzen 7 CPU. Just a quick disclaimer, I don't have any of this hardware to test, so I feel I should mention that I'm basing this recommendation on information that I've found online, as well as in other videos on YouTube. Well, it's about time I wrap this video up. Please hit the like button if this video helped you with your decision to purchase an RX 570, or if you simply enjoyed watching it. Share it with your friends and subscribe to my channel if you are not already. And if you would like to help support what I do on my channel, please check out my Amazon store at the link in the video description, where you can purchase an RX 570 like the one I used for this video, as well as other products I have featured in past videos. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you have a fantastic day, and I look forward to hanging out again in another video. We'll catch you later.